the theme for today is undercover policing, can it be made accountable? As I said, our first speaker is a good starting point to inform the debate. He's Rob Evans, who's an investigative journalist who's written on this subject and has won numerous awards on corruption and undercover policing and freedom of information. Rob's a leading authority. His book Undercover provides some very informative material on undercover policing and the SDS. Today he's going to provide highlights and update us of his work on the SDS and in light of Hearn and Ellison. A review of Rob's book with Paul Lewis says, if these stories were not real, they'd be like an airport thriller. So I hand over to you, Rob, to thrill us.
Hello. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm hoping that you can hear me at the back. You can, great. Okay then. I thought what I'd do is just give a sort of summary of where of what the undercover operations were about. I know that plenty of people here sort of know a lot about this. I'm going to start in 1968, which is when the story starts, because that's the year when the government, the establishment and politicians felt real fear that protest was, there were lots of people protesting and it was going to, they felt overwhelmed, they felt threatened, they felt that perhaps they would be overwhelmed. And what the police came to the conclusion that they perhaps couldn't cope with the sort of rising tide of protest. And so they came up with a radical plan. Up to then, what the police had done is they had sort of relied on informants for information about what radical and protest groups were doing. And, you know, informants are people who are already in a group which they've sort of recruited to give them information. But in the police's eyes, the problem with informants is that they're not reliable enough. That they can sort of exaggerate, they can make things up. And what the police always feel much more comfortable with is having their own officers, you know, observing and sort of reporting back what's going on. So they came up with, at the time, what was quite a novel and radical plan, which was to, in a sense, take a police officer and turn him into an activist to go and live within the life of an activist for long periods, for 4 or 5, years, and of course they have lived for longer than that. What they needed to do was to provide these police officers with a new identity, and what the police officers started doing was going around and trawling through the archives of birth and death certificates and finding they would in effect steal the identities of dead children and take that identity and live that life and resurrect that identity and live it as if that dead child had lived. And they would go to the archives and trawl through all these certificates and find someone who was about their age, would have been their age if they had lived on, and had the first name that they had. So, for example, there was an undercover officer called John Dines. He took the identity of a boy called John Barker. And what they're thinking there is that it's very difficult for someone to take a new first name and react to it naturally. So if you're John, and someone calls you, and you pretend to be Bob, that if someone calls you Bob, you don't automatically react as if someone's called you John, where you just turn around and say, yes, what is it? Once they've sort of alighted, and it was quite a laborious process, that. And once they had alighted on a dead child and taken their identity, then they would research the family, and they would go to where that family lived, and they would go and look around the area, what the landmarks were. And what they want, why they're doing that is that once they want to feel comfortable in their new fake identity. And the more comfortable they feel, the more secure they feel. Because a lot of undercover officers, when they actually go in, you know, in their undercover mission, they do have they feel that they could be uncovered at any time. And what they want to, why they're researching the life of the dead child, is that they want to make sure that they're not caught out. So, in one example, say that they've gone to, gone undercover, and they pretend they're from Stoke-on-Trent, and they're in a group where someone has actually come from Stoke-on-Trent, and they say, oh yeah, I remember that, the post office is, you know, do you know that pub? And they don't know where that pub is, then people might think, you know, who are you? It might raise suspicions. So once they've got the identity of the dead boy, this was in the early days they used to do this, then they would build on that identity, and they would be given flats, paid for by the police. They would also be issued documents in the name of that false identity. They'd be given passports, driving licenses, and they would also be given fake records within government databases. They'd be given, you know, a fake tax record. Why are they doing that? Because sometimes there would be activists who would work in, you know, central government or a Whitehall department, and they would run checks on people. And what they wanted to do was, when someone ran a check on them, that a record would come back. And if it didn't, that would raise suspicions. And they would also get jobs that were often sort of part-time or flexible, because they wanted a job, but they wanted a job that didn't really get in the way of what they primarily wanted to do, which was to spy on political groups. And they would go out and live this life for, you know, 5 or 6 days a week, and go back to their real families 1 or 2 days a week. So what would the undercover cops do? They would live the life of an activist for long periods, and they would be hoovering up information. They would just hoover up all the information about, you know, the group they were targeted at, what the group was up to, who were the leading people in it, what did they think, what were they planning to do. And they were, in a sense, just hoovering up all of this information, reporting it back to their superiors, and they were giving the police advance notice of protests and demonstrations that were coming up, so the police could decide how they were going to deal with it. And they would infiltrate groups right across the political spectrum, right, left, right, radical groups. There's a very wide range. We don't know at the moment how many political groups were infiltrated by the undercover police, but we do know that there were at least 460 groups infiltrated since 1968. I would hope that the Pitchford inquiry would give us a list of those 100, you know, all the groups that were infiltrated. How many undercover officers there were, we don't know at the moment, but I think the best estimate is that there would be about 130, 140, something in that region. 13 have been identified so far. Later on today, you'll hear a lot of what, you know, those undercover officers were doing. You'll hear about how they were forming relationships with women, deceiving them. Police now accept that this was abusive and wrong. Why were the police doing this? I think one reason is that it gave them very good cover. People tend to accept other people, you know, people if they're in a relationship with their friends. It's a sort of natural thing. And what it does is it counteracts one of the undercover officers' weaknesses, is that if you've taken on a fake identity, you can never allow the people that you're spying on to actually meet your real family and friends, because they will automatically say, oh yeah, you know, Bill, oh yeah, he's a police officer. So one thing that they had to do was constantly make up excuses for why the people they were spying on could never meet their parents and their friends. Another thing that you'll hear about are about allegations about how the police spied on workers who trade unionists and passed that information on to companies who blacklisted them. You'll also hear about how the spies the undercover officers collected information on families who were campaigning for justice, you know, about over their relatives who had died in police custody or after contact with the police. I think that there's been at least 18 families between the 1980s and 2005 who the police collected information on. I think that figure will probably rise. This was a very elaborate operation. For many years, the police went to great lengths to keep it secret. And, you know, when the undercover officers exited their mission, when they left their mission, when their deployment came to an end, they had to make up elaborate stories, which was what they wanted to do was they wanted to ensure that the activists and the people they had been spying on didn't come and track them down. And they had, you hear this about how they made up stories. I mean, there was one undercover officer, Bob Lambert, he made up a very elaborate story about how the special branch were about to arrest him. And he had to flee to Spain, you know, which he did. And for years and years, people thought he had fled to Spain. And he was a hero because, you know, he had got away from the police. But all the time, he had actually gone back to Special Branch in Scotland Yard and was working there. You also hear about how another favourite tactic they would have is to fake that they were having a breakdown. And John Dines, for example, he was an undercover officer. Mark Jenner, he did the same thing. You know, it was a favourite tactic where they would say, I'm having a breakdown, I've got to go away and get my head together for a while. And then they would try to, end their deployment in that way. There was the first unit that was set up the first undercover unit was called the Special Demonstration Squad. It operated from 1968 to 2008. In the late 90s, the undercover operation was expanded when a second unit was set up, which is called the National Public Order Intelligence Unit. It was doing the same thing, but it was on a wider, it was doing it across the country. The Special Demonstration Squad was focused on London, but the MPRU its operations were across the country. I think it is remarkable that they did keep this secret. The police kept it secret for years and years. The first time the public heard of the words the Special Demonstration Squad was in the BBC programme in 2002, where some details were brought to light, were exposed. But I think that was a programme that was very much on the police's terms. And for example, when I watched it, I always thought it left you with the impression that this was an undercover operation that happened a long time ago. That was a deliberate thing, I think, by the police. They wanted, I think, in that programme to sort of gain some acknowledgement that this had happened. But they didn't want to sort of tip people off to think that it was actually still going on. I think 2010 is really the year when things began to break open and the public really begin to get a chance of seeing what's happening, what was happening. Early in that year, the one and only undercover officer who has publicly come out and blown the whistle, Peter Francis, started to tell his story. And then in the autumn of 2010, you have Mark Kennedy, who was an undercover officer who infiltrated environmental movement for 7 years. He was exposed. And I think what the exposure of Mark Kennedy showed is something that is a very powerful part of this whole story, is that he was exposed by those people that he had been spying on. He was exposed by one of the women he had had a long relationship with, and they were activists who helped to expose him. And what we're seeing there, of course, is, the people who were spied on are turning the tables on the spies and beginning to dig out the information about what had happened to them, putting together all the pieces of the jigsaw. And I think that's a very powerful form of accountability. And also it's something that's very uncomfortable for the police because, it is exposing what they've done. Since 2010, of course, we've had lots of disclosures about what the undercover officers were doing. And in a sort of typical establishment style, the authorities really responded by trying to contain it, by setting up what were private inquiries. These were every time something came up, they would say, oh yeah, let's have an inquiry into that. But it was always behind closed doors, always looking at a small part of it. And I mean, I think in a way it got a bit ridiculous because at one point I think the number of inquiries that they had reached 15. It was just amazing, actually. You had the police setting up their own inquiry called Operation Hearn, which was an inquiry led by the Chief Constable of Derbyshire, Mick Creedon, who was looking at this. And of course, the problem with that is always the old problem, is that it was the police investigating themselves. In 2013, Peter Francis, who had been anonymous up to then, disclosed that he and other undercover officers had spied on Stephen Lawrence's campaign, Dwayne Brooks, who was the only witness to the killing of Stephen Lawrence. There was a report by a QC, Mark Ellison, in 2014, who in effect who said that the Met had, in a quite explosive phrase, planted a spy in the Lawrence family campaign. And at that point, Theresa May, the Home Secretary, decided to set up a public inquiry to look at the whole business, which is where we are now.